Hey everybody, this is Tim and welcome to the show. So the human hand has 27 bones. A Rubik's Cube has 27 cubes. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart wrote 27 arias before he died. And there's something about that number, especially when it pertains to rock and roll, that comes up again and again. And it's amazing how many artists, young artists, have died at 27. And we're going to check out some of the most famous members of the 27 Club. Let's get started. Janis Joplin was born and raised in the gritty oil refinery town of Port Arthur, Texas. But in 1963, she came here to San Francisco to play some of the beatnik bars that were located along here on Grant Street. But it's where she first started turning heads with her raw and sometimes raunchy style, a style she claims was modeled after blues great Bessie Smith. But along with it came a reputation as a hard drinker and a speed freak. And she spent a lot of time at what is now this corner liquor store that used to be called the Hot Dog Palace, or as the locals referred to it in the day as the Amp Palace. And it was absolutely the most notorious place in all of 60s era San Francisco to buy, sell, or trade. So let's walk up to Broadway right here, something I want to show you. This is Broadway in Columbus, and what is the most notorious part of San Francisco. It's filled with a strange mixture of tourist traps and topless bars, and it's got a weirdly dangerous vibe to it. Janis moved back and forth between Texas and California several times, and it wasn't until 1966 when she hooked up with an established local band called Big Brother and the Holding Company that she was able to stay here. They gradually gained momentum, and by the time they played the Monterey Pop Festival in '67, they were primed and ready. And that's the day that she went from being part of Big Brother to becoming a star in her own right here. Janis lived and partied in this Haight-Ashbury neighborhood and had a place just a couple blocks down on Lyon Street. She was actually a very approachable rock star and spent a lot of time in the former clothing store here called Masitica, which was owned by good friend and sometime lover Peggy Caserta, who, by the way, is credited for inventing the bell-bottom 646 Levi jean that took the world by storm. By 1969, Janis had moved on to a solo career, but her personal life had become somewhat of a mess. She'd become a heavy drinker and heroin user, and by the fall of 1970, she found herself in Los Angeles recording what would be her last and maybe finest album, Pearl. Janis Joplin's last night on Earth was fairly typical. She spent the day at the studio listening to playbacks of Buried in the Blues. She was supposed to get together with Peggy Caserta, but was stood up and decided to go with the band to Barney's Beanery to unwind. And she played some pool and drank some screwdrivers before going back to her room here at the Landmark Hotel. And it was about 1 a.m. when she arrived back here from Barney's, and she immediately went alone to her room. Earlier in the day, she had scored China White from a dealer and decided to indulge herself now. Instead of mainlining the heroin, she decided to skin pop, which takes a little longer to enter the system. And in the meantime, she discovered she was out of cigarettes, and she went to the lobby here to the cigarette machine to buy a pack. It was later discovered that the heroin she OD'd on had been brought to the U.S. by someone named the Count, who was a French drug dealer who also supplied to the likes of Keith Richards and other rock and roll royalty from Europe. Janis wasn't found till about 18 hours later, wedged between the bed and the nightstand. The unopened pack of Marlboros were on the nightstand, and she was still clutching the $4.50 change in her hand. Janis Joplin, 27 years old. By late 1968, it seemed like everybody wanted a piece of Jimi Hendrix. There were promoters, journalists, fans, other musicians, and they just couldn't get enough of him. He played like no one else, he looked like no one else, and he had an aura like no one else before or since, quite frankly. Jimmy's home was in London, and although he'd grown up in Seattle and spent a lot of time in New York City, he was very taken with Los Angeles and started spending a lot of his free time here. In October of 1968, Jimmy and the Experience came here to Hollywood to record some new tracks, and they chose this now-defunct TTG Studios here on Macadam Boulevard. We're right kitty corner from Hollywood High School right there. Not much got done, and according to bandmates Noel Redding and Mitch Mitchell, it was just a long succession of hangers-on and connections stopping by to party. But there are some tracks that did end up seeing the light of day, including their incredible cover of Gloria, right here at TTG Studios. When he was in LA, Jimmy liked to frequent clubs and go to parties like the Whiskey A Go-Go down the street on Sunset. But the place he hung out at the most was called The Experience. Its front door was right here where this doggy daycare is now. Hendrix was here so much that the owner had a giant Hendrix head painted on the front doors with its mouth around the double doors. And I think a lot of people thought Jimmy owned the place, and he would jam here on an almost nightly basis with the likes of Johnny Winter, Rick Derringer, and Mike Pinera. But the continuing pressures of fame would still hound him. There were the constant requests for interviews, more records, more money to be made off him. And it didn't help that there was a lot of hangers-on here with an endless supply of drugs. And by September of 1970, Jimmy found himself living back in London. So on September 15th, 1970, Jimmy played a club date at Ronnie Scott's nightclub in London, where he was playing a gig co-headlined by Eric Burdon Moore. And he was spending time with several different girlfriends, but in particular one, she was a Danish model named Monica Dannemann. On September 17th, Jimmy had been hanging out with Monica in her room at the Samarkand Hotel in Notting Hill, and they were at a party where they partook in several drugs, particularly amphetamines, and returned to the hotel at around 2 a.m. Monica fixed Jimmy a tuna sandwich and went to bed, and at 6 a.m. found Jimmy still awake. He was drinking wine and unable to sleep after the effects of the uppers he had taken at the party. And in what would prove to be the absolute worst decision of his life, they took some barbiturates so that he could sleep. Jimmy died that morning from choking on the undigested food, unable to wake up in his altered state. And on September 18, 1970, the world lost, if not its finest, then its most innovative musician ever. Jimi Hendrix, 27 years old. During the Rolling Stones' first foray into America in 1964 on their 9-date tour, very ill-attended, and the highlight had to have been the 45 seconds of music they performed here at the Hollywood Palace, Dean Martin's Hollywood Palace. And the most memorable part of that was Dean Martin drunkenly making fun of their hair. Brian Jones was a blues fanatic and was actually the guy that formed the Rolling Stones and was their undeniable leader for much of their early time together. And he could play anything and play it well. Slide guitar, blues harp, recorder, saxophone. But he wasn't a songwriter, and when Mick and Keith turned out to be very adept at it, it usurped his position in the band and sent him down the road, at least as far as the Stones were concerned, to insignificance. By 1967, the Stones were drifting further and further away from their hardcore blues roots for a more commercially pop sound, and Brian was increasingly pushed to the side. And to cope, he was falling deeper and deeper into booze and drug addiction, to the point that from albums Beggar's Banquet on, he rarely showed up to the sessions, and when he did, he was regulated to playing maracas or some acoustic guitar bits. And in June of 1969, Brian announced his departure from the Stones. On the night of July 2nd, Brian was partying with a select few people on his English country estate, which was once owned by Winnie the Pooh author A.A. Milne, and just after midnight on the 3rd, was found drowned at the bottom of his swimming pool. The official cause was death by misadventure, brought on by alcohol and drug abuse, but as with a lot of these untimely deaths of famous people, there's been more than a little speculation that Brian's misadventure was indeed a murder. Brian Jones, 27 years old.
Ron McKernan was the son of a Bay Area disc jockey, so he fell in love with R&B music and records at a very young age. He was a self-taught musician who played harmonica and keyboards and had a beyond his years whiskey-soaked voice that he used to great effect to sing the blues. So now we're about 30 miles south of San Francisco in Palo Alto, and this is the former location of Dana Morgan's music shop. And the alley here is where the first germ of the Grateful Dead occurred on New Year's Eve in 1963 when Jerry Garcia invited Bob Weir to come in and jam. It wasn't long before Ron McKernan, who had met Jerry briefly a couple months before in the Zodiacs, joined them to form Mother McCree's Uptown Jug Band, and at the behest of Ron, morphed into the electric rock band The Warlocks, which of course morphed into the Dead. And by the way, Ron was originally the frontman of the Grateful Dead. He sang most of their lead and was the definite focus of their live shows. The former Dana Morgan's music shop right here. Ron McKernan was nicknamed Blue Ron because of his taste in music, but it wasn't long before his bandmates started referring to him as Pigpen because of his uncanny hygienic similarity to the beloved Peanuts character. So this is 710 Ashbury, and this was the Grateful Dead's communal home during the Summer of Love. There was a famous drug bust here in '67. I think they found like a pound of weed, but they were eventually let off with a slap on the wrist. With his biker image and gruff style, Pigpen was perfect for the early blues-centric material the band was first playing. But as the Dead began evolving into what would become their jamming, psychedelic style, Pigpen just couldn't seem to keep up, and more found himself sitting on the sidelines, regulated to playing congas and adding a few background vocals. And it's just my opinion, but his role in the band bears a lot of similarity to what happened to Brian Jones in the Rolling Stones. Right here, 710 Ashbury. You know, Ron McKernan wasn't a big partaker in the LSD scene of the 60s, but that wasn't to say he was an angel. He had a love affair with alcohol to the point that by 26, he had to stop touring because of the mounting health issues, which led him to break off all personal relationships with the band, and he claimed, "I don't want you to be around when I die." It was at the very least heartbreaking because by all accounts he was the nicest, most unassuming guy you could possibly meet. But in March of 1973, he died of gastrointestinal bleeding, which was caused by alcoholism. Ron Pigpen McKernan was just 27 years old. So this next artist is one of my personal favorite musicians ever, and we've actually done a full-length video on him, and I'll put a link to it below if you want to check it out. But I'm talking about Alan Blind Al Wilson of Canned Heat. Alan was born in Arlington, Massachusetts, and he attended Boston College as a music major, but he spent most of his college time befriending and helping legendary bluesmen like Son House, who would be touring through Boston at the time. And as a matter of fact, he did so at the peril of pursuing his own musical studies. But after college, he took a road trip out here with musician John Fahey, and Fahey took to calling Alan Blind Al because of his Coke bottle thick glasses. And that evolved into Blind Al because if you take a good look at Alan, he does kind of look like an owl.
Anyways, one thing led to another, and in 1965, Alan met fellow blues fanatic Bob Haidt, and they formed Canned Heat. So this is Topanga Canyon and the former site of Bob Haidt's house. And in 1970, this is where Canned Heat would rehearse and hang out. So let's go check it out. So this is not the original Bob Haidt house. It was the one built after and is now abandoned right here. Alan's personal life was a bit of a mess. He's been described as highly intelligent but awkward and unable to maintain a meaningful relationship with the opposite sex. I don't know if they had a word for it then, but if you want my guess, he was autistic, or at least in the spectrum. Alan's great love besides music was nature, and he was an avid camper to the point that he preferred to sleep outside under the stars. And this extended to when Canned Heat would tour. Alan would often grab his sleeping bag and bed down on a urban green space near the band hotel. But as time wore on, he found himself living out of his van and feeling ever more socially isolated. He actually spent time in a psychiatric hospital, and he was self-medicating with barbiturates or Reds to sleep. In September of 1970, on the eve of reluctantly leaving for a European tour, Alan had taken his sleeping bag and trudged up this steep hill right here to bed down for the night. And he wasn't found till the next morning by manager Skip Taylor. But the question still remains, was it suicide or accidental? And why were there still Reds left in the baggie besides Alan's body the next morning? Now, since I made that original video, I have had a chance to talk to manager Skip Taylor, who actually found the body, and he maintains that it was a suicide, no question about it. But whatever the case may be, on September 3rd, 1970, the world lost one of the greatest musicians to ever grace its stage, Alan Blind Al Wilson, 27 years old. So we all know that Kurt Cobain and Nirvana were part of the Seattle grunge scene. They formed in the small logging town of Aberdeen, Washington in 1987, and then in 1991 blew the scene wide open with their album Nevermind. But by late 91, Kurt had moved here to Los Angeles in the Fairfax district, and like most rockers who lived in the area, he would come here to Canner's almost on a daily basis to hang out, have coffee, and do lunch. I think it's safe to say that Kurt was the voice of his generation, and his crazy talented songwriting has to be right up there with John Lennon or David Bowie. Whatever it was, Kurt Cobain exploded with it. But I think, like a lot of these talented people, he was sensitive and had a thin skin, but hid it behind an extremely, I don't give a shit about what you think bravado. But sometimes it did show up in the writing, and just listen to Nirvana's Rape Me. Appreciate your concern, you're gonna stink and burn. So now we're a couple blocks away on Spalding Avenue, and this is the apartment that Kurt shared with Courtney Love when they first got together in '91. Kurt had a chronic stomach problem and would occasionally do heroin to cope with the pain, which may have been the reason for his problem in the first place. But the fact of the matter is that Kurt became a bona fide junkie by the time he was living here. And he spent days at a time locked up and getting high and painting. And when he did tour, he did it with the aid of methadone. So by the late summer of '92, Kurt had checked himself into a rehab at Cedars-Sinai Hospital here. And coincidentally, it was the same hospital that his daughter was being born in at the time. But rehab was very short-lived, and it wouldn't be long before he was doing heroin again. Kurt Cobain, Courtney Love. Kurt Cobain continued to experience debilitating stomach pain and couldn't seem to cope with his life and fame and newfound good fortune. And it always seemed to me that in some misdirected punk rock way, he was embarrassed over the fact that he still wasn't some penniless rocker. And over the next 18 months, he fell even deeper into a drug-fueled despair.
In March of '94, he was on tour with Nirvana here in Rome when it was reported that he was rushed to the hospital after collapsing due to fatigue and influenza. But Courtney Love later claimed that it was a deliberate suicide attempt where he'd taken over 50 pills. And it all culminated in April of '94 up in Seattle when Kurt put a gun to his head, a shotgun, and pulled the trigger. He left a long and rambling suicide note where he quoted Neil Young, of course, saying it's better to burn out than to fade away. Kurt Cobain, just 27 years old. James Douglas Morrison was the son of a Navy commander and spent his early life moving around a lot. And at 20 years old, he came to Los Angeles to attend film school here at UCLA. And that, of course, is where he first met fellow student and music enthusiast Ray Manzarek. So, among other things, what was unusual about Jim was he was a voracious reader to the point where he would sometimes give essays at school here to professors about some obscure 17th century book, and the professors would actually check with the Library of Congress to see if he was lying or not, and he wasn't. But he took to the outsider image. He liked it, and it wasn't a big stretch for him. But books weren't the only voracious appetite Jim Morrison had. He was a heavy drinker, and he strived to be the last man standing when he did. And although he had a long-time relationship with girlfriend Pam Corson, when she wasn't there, he was usually with a young fan or a stripper from the club around the block. UCLA. You know, Jim Morrison's life has been pretty well chronicled. Oliver Stone did the movie with him. But the boundaries of his life in 1970 pretty much consisted of a block radius of where I'm standing right now. This is where he slept, where he ate, where he drank, where he loved. And anyways, the first place would be right here, so let's take a look. Directly across the street would have been the Phone Booth, which was a strip club. And Jim whiled away many an afternoon here with the dancers, and one can only imagine what went on. And right next door is the Alta Cienega Motel. It's now completely abandoned except for this guard dog, but it's where Jim lived when he wasn't with Pam, and it was easy access for the many liaisons he had with the ladies that worked next door. Room 32 was his preferred room, and before the motel closed a couple of years ago, it had become somewhat of a shrine to Jim. And speaking of the motel, I'm not sure what's to become of it, but from the very limited view here of room 32 from the street, it would appear that the room's magnificent graffiti has been painted over. So just across the street on Santa Monica Boulevard is where this Tale of the Pup hot dog stand is now, and it was once the Doors rehearsal studio. They referred to it as the Clubhouse, and besides being their business offices where they met on a daily basis, it's also where they recorded what might be their very best album, L.A. Woman. So back around the corner on La Cienega would be the Elektra Records offices, and this is where they recorded Soft Parade in the basement studio and where they would have interfaced with their record company. And then directly across the street was girlfriend Pam Corson's boutique. It was called Themis, and right next door to that would have been Jim's production office where he was working on his film Highway. Lastly would be a short walk around the corner to Jim's favorite watering hole, Barney's Beanery. And you gotta wonder if Jim hung out here more just because it was convenient than anything else. But whatever the case, he was here a lot, and Barney's has seen fit to put a plaque on the bar in front of Jim's favorite seat. So welcome to Jim Morrison's Los Angeles world, circa 1970. So this brings us back to Paris, France, where the end began, and the third floor apartment Jim shared with Pam here on Rue Bertrelli. I hope I pronounced that right. When Jim Morrison left LA for Paris in 1971, it was in the public's mind just a hiatus, but in Jim's mind it was quite permanent. He wanted to put the litigation and trials and the constant recognition behind him and live the life of an anonymous poet on the streets of Paris. Although the official cause of death was heart failure, it's not clear whether it was caused by Jim's alcoholism or if it was actually a heroin overdose, but nevertheless, Jim died here on July 3rd, 1971, exactly 2 years to the day after Brian Jones. So fittingly, we're here at Père Lachaise Cemetery at Jim Morrison's grave. And as luck would have it, they're working on something right next door. This is the quietest place in the world except for today. There it is right there. In my humble opinion, Jim Morrison was just one of those people that does everything to excess: eat, drink, party, love. And it finally got the best of him. So there's been a ton of speculation on what really happened with Jim Morrison the night he died. There's Pam Corson's story, and then there's all the other stories. And we've actually made a full-length video of it, if you'd like to check it out on the channel. I think we answer some of the questions about it. There was never an autopsy performed, and his burial here was attended by just 5 people, including Doors manager Bill Siddons and girlfriend Pamela Corson, who died just 3 years later in Los Angeles of a heroin overdose. And by the way, she was 27 years old. Jim Morrison, 27 years old. So there's a pretty long list of other people that passed away at 27, and I'm going to read that to you, but I think we got to get out of here because this steam shovel they have going here is pretty noisy. So let's check some of this other stuff out while we talk. And I would start with Amy Winehouse, and the official cause of death was alcohol poisoning, but she was pretty out of control, including a long history of heroin addiction, and that was July 23rd, 2011 in London. Dave Alexander, who was the original bassist for Iggy and the Stooges, one of my favorite bands, and he was either kicked out or quit the band in 1975, and he died of pancreatitis that was linked to his alcohol abuse. Kristen Pfaff, she was the bassist in Courtney Love's band Hole, and she died in Seattle of a heroin overdose in 1994, just a couple months after Kurt Cobain did. Here's one of my favorites, Dee Boone, who was singer, guitarist, and all-around nice guy in the Minutemen. I had the privilege of meeting him a few times. He was a good guy. He died in 1985 in an accident that occurred when the band's van, when they were on tour, flipped over. He died. I believe it happened in Arizona. Mia Zapata, lead singer of the band The Gits, she was brutally murdered in 1993 in Seattle. I think someone's made a documentary of it, as she walked home from a bar. And her murder went unsolved for 10 full years. Pete Ham, who was the original singer in Badfinger, he died by hanging himself in Surrey, England in 1975. I think he was just a few days short of his 28th birthday. Chris Bell, who was the guitarist and co-lead singer in one of my favorite bands, 70s power pop band Big Star, he wrapped his car around a telephone pole in 1975, not far from his Memphis, Tennessee home. And last but not least is one of my favorite members of the 27 Club, and that would be Robert Johnson. Robert Johnson was a Mississippi Delta bluesman, and it was rumored that he had made a pact with the devil to play. He was a major influence, writing songs like Terrapin Blues and Crossroads. If you've ever listened to any British guitarist from the late 60s and 70s, he's been a major influence on him. Page and Clapton have covered him before. It was all cut short by his death in 1938, and as you might imagine, it's shrouded in mystery, the cause being everything from syphilis to being poisoned by a jealous lover. But I have to say that the one thing that is a thread that connects all the musicians we covered here is that they were all very talented, but they were all very, very young, and they were really kids. And it's just ironic that that happens. So anyways, that's going to wrap it up for us here. This is 27, and it's been a blast bringing it to you from, of all places, Paris, France. This is the greatest city in the world as far as I'm concerned. If you like what you saw, please like and subscribe to the channel. We've got a great back catalog. If you like classic rock, you should check it out. And for Tim, I'd just like to say thanks. Let's be kind to one another. Au revoir. Bye.